That's where we are today on day 6 of this shutdown, which definitely will have an impact here in Hampton Roads and also potentially on upcoming elections here in Virginia. And with that, we're going to bring in political analyst from Virginia Wesleyan University, Dr. Leslie Caughell, who is with us this morning. So much to discuss here. Let's first start with the shutdown, because this really has been a case of positions that aren't usual from both sides. And I know from your expertise here, it's kind of like the roles have been reversed in the arguments.
Yeah, so just in general, in the past, you've heard Democrats argue that a clean funding bill is exactly what you kind of vote on here. This is not a time for policymaking. And they're really digging in their heels. They're thinking this is their opportunity to take a stand on the 3 things that they've identified as so important. And they've expressed a willingness to do something they weren't willing to do 6 months ago, which is deal with a government shutdown and the possibility that the Trump administration is going to use this time to cut departments they've wanted to cut and not done the number of cuts to the depth they want yet. At the same time, you've got Republicans who seem to be, and you just saw this from Speaker Johnson, pretty certain that the messaging war here for them is easy and it's straightforward, and that they can take some of their pet issues like illegal immigration and they can pigeonhole this into illegal immigration, and that's going to trump any kind of resonance that this healthcare argument has with voters. So I guess we'll see over time, but the reality is voters do not like government shutdowns. This is not government functioning as it's supposed to, and the longer and longer this thing drags on, the more risk I think both parties run that voters are just going to get really upset. And sometimes when voters get really upset, you can't predict where that anger is going to be directed and how.
And with us now in day 6, we have gone through a weekend now with the government shutdown, and hearing the rhetoric that you just heard from Speaker Johnson and then the things that have been said over the weekend from leaders from the other side of the aisle. Do you see this ending anytime soon, or do we think this could drag out potentially to what was the last one at 35 days?
I don't see this ending anytime soon. And, you know, if you're sitting in my chair, the one thing you never want to do is make predictions, because in politics, those are almost always wrong. But I will tell you, when I look at these things, I think a lot about the incentive structures for people to do things like negotiate and to end this. And I don't think either side views the incentive structure as pushing them toward a position in which they move. And certainly, I don't see both sides engaging in any sort of compromise, because what we've seen is, you know, Mike Johnson in particular saying, we're not debating this. It's done. This is a take it or leave it proposition, and kind of that's where you're at. And I would also say, too, one of the things that you've seen Republicans, and we saw this a lot on the Sunday talk shows and in interviews over the weekend as well, try to do is attach what I would argue are blatant falsehoods about the U.S. healthcare system and illegal immigration to part of this debate, to take what is maybe a larger healthcare issue and bring it back into that cultural issue fold. So I don't know that we can call this debate in any way anchored in kind of truth. And when that's the case, it becomes even harder to think about people on the same page in the way that you would need them to get on the same page and to sit down and negotiate together to bring the shutdown to an end, but bring you to a bill that, you know, gets you toward the kind of functional government that we need. I think there's something that's always telling to me when we think about this particular shutdown. This is a bill that's essentially just taking the negotiations and adding a few extra weeks to it. This is not the final funding package. And I think that just tells you how dysfunctional this Congress is. It's not just that you can't get a funding bill out of it. You can't get an extension to continue negotiating a funding bill out of it.
And you know, in the past, President Trump has called himself the master negotiator. And in this particular case, we're seeing, you know, posts by him on social media that have been mocking of Democrats in the process. And you just have to think, okay, what role is the president taking in trying to reach a deal between the sides? And I think all of that is factoring in with how this is playing out so far, and then the longevity of how this shutdown could be. But, you know, one thing that you mentioned is voters do not like government shutdowns. And We may not be at the midterm election yet at the federal level, but we certainly have an important election taking place right here in Virginia. And so I want to ask you, before we get into a poll that was recently released, is how do you see this potentially impacting how voters feel when they go to the polls in a month?
So generally, this is kind of a sad thing to say, but I would argue that most voters in such a highly polarized and partisan environment are not movable. There's not a whole lot that you're going to do to take those strong partisans and convince them to vote for somebody of the opposite party. What candidates have to be terrified about is that people are going to either get so disgusted they stay home, or they get so disgusted they would have stayed home and they go and vote for your opposition. So I think you really run the risk of taking the voter base that you were kind of relying on, the voter base that we're always trying to estimate through these polls, and moving it around with this situation, which is outside the mainstream. And let's not forget, in places like Virginia, the government is a huge employer. Sending people to work without pay is a big deal. And it's not like if you live in the state of Virginia, particularly in kind of the more populous areas, you don't know somebody who works for the federal government. It's also not like you're not going to interact, particularly if this goes weeks, with services that the federal government normally provided that you now can't get in quite the same way. And some of it might seem small, like not being able to visit a Smithsonian museum, but some of them are quite central to people's lives.
And also, I want to mention here quick, a new KFF poll. For those who don't know, KFF, it's a independent health policy research organization that often puts out information and polling. And what I found really interesting out of this poll is that it says nearly 80% of Americans want those ACA tax credits extended, including 59% of Republicans and 57% of people who consider themselves MAGA supporters. And so when we're talking about that portion of this debate, it seems as though there's a lot of support for extending those subsidies, which makes you think, again, how this all will translate. I mean, how this all will transpire in the end. But Leslie, getting back on that in terms of this Virginia election statewide, we got a new poll that just came out the end of last week. And I want to read some of the numbers to you. I'm sure that you have already seen it and know it, etc. But this is from Emerson College. And it shows at the statewide level that for governor, we have Democratic candidate Abigail Spanberger holding a 10-point lead over Republican Winsome Earl Sears. That's in that race for governor. It says support has been increasing for Spanberger among voters under 50. Meanwhile, older voters still split on Earl Sears at this point. When we get into those issues, this is what I wanted to bring up with you as we're talking about this shutdown. The top issues for Virginia voters, 35% say economy, 20% say threats to democracy. Education and healthcare then come next. Immigration and crime were near the bottom of this particular list of priorities. When you hear that, when you see that, and you see the debate that's going on right now at the federal level, what sense do you make out of that in terms of both parties' positions?
So when I look at that data, I think it's a reminder, in part because Virginia is so closely tied to the federal government, that Virginians know a little bit more about the function of the federal government, and they have slightly different attitudes than, say, voters in Iowa. And that means, I think, for Lieutenant Governor Sears here, there are a lot more risks to this shutdown than perhaps for somebody in the out party, right, for Spanberger, because she can kind of go in and she can say, this is my vision for the economy, this should not be happening, this is hurting Virginians. And it's a lot harder for the Republican lieutenant governor to criticize the Trump administration, to separate herself from the Trump administration. And we know that one of the things that carried President Trump over in his electoral college victory, in his popular vote victory this last time, was that he increased his margins among non-white voters and among young voters. And in terms of the economy is kind of going okay for some people. For young people, it's not. They seem to be hardest hit by some of the questions about jobs and the like. So, you're alienating a coalition that's been really helping Republicans, and you're doing so in a state where, the federal government ties are so tight that you really have to assume the longer this government shutdown goes on, really the more difficult it gets for Winsome Sears to navigate this particular topic, right? To make sure she differentiates herself enough that she's not off-putting to voters who are like, this is absurd, this is crazy, perhaps even this is anti-democratic, without upsetting the Trump administration. And I will say, candidates are very hesitant to criticize the president, in part because the president is not very hesitant to make statements against those candidates, even when everybody in kind of these party leadership coalition is like, let's not do any damage here, let's not draw blood. He doesn't seem to kind of weigh those concerns in quite the same way a traditional candidate does. So Sears is really boxed in here, I think. And, she's had a rough campaign, and there's been a lot of shift in her staffing. There's been questions from Republicans about her campaign messaging and strategy. This is not what you want if you're the Republican going into October in a campaign where Americans are already voting. Virginians are already voting.
Well, over the weekend, one might argue that Republicans in Virginia got a little bit of a boost when it comes to their messaging. And we're going to talk about what was the talker of the weekend and still into this morning. Leaked text messages from Attorney General candidate Jay Jones that appear to show him saying that in a hypothetical scenario, if he had to choose between then House Speaker Todd Gilbert, or Republican, this is back in 2022, these messages, he would shoot Gilbert over dictators, a series of dictators, two other dictators. And then also there were things that apparently with the reporting alluding to Gilbert's children, and I mean just really bad text messages that came out. You saw Jay Jones have to come out and apologize over the weekend. Abigail Spanberger condemning those messages. Republicans now calling for Jay Jones to step down from out of the race, from his opponent, Jason Miyares, to Winsome Earl Sears calling for it. And as of the last few hours, President Donald Trump saying that Jay Jones needs to get out of this race and him officially endorsing Jason Miyares. First, I'm going to just toss it to you with this, Leslie. When you saw the reports of that text messaging, what were your initial thoughts about the messages and then also the response from, let's go with the Democratic side first. I mean, I don't even know what to say when I saw them. What do you, in a campaign season, for that to come out, what kind of damage can that play to the party?
So first, in terms of my thoughts when I saw these are absolutely grotesque messages that there's no argument that you can really make that situates them in a way that mitigates just the general damage they do. And I think for Democrats who are campaigning in Virginia, this Attorney General's race was going to be the tightest race. This was absolutely the one people were paying the most attention to. There was a lot of hope that Spanberger leading by 10 points would really help bring Jay Jones up to the threshold he needed, particularly because the polling shows it to be so close. So this really hurts, not just Jay Jones, but Abigail Spanberger, who has to answer questions and will have to answer questions about this, who knows for how long, but she certainly can't brush them off because, again, these are grotesque text messages and they hit so close to a political assassination when we've already been talking about rhetoric and political violence. So this is a timely topic. So this is a political scandal that I'm sure the Spanberger campaign, is not excited about, did not want, and they have run such a tight, focused, disciplined, and quite frankly, conservative campaign to have this come out in October and essentially derail what I'm sure was their plan for what that messaging was going to be in the final weeks of the campaign is so problematic. And, again, I've said earlier, I don't know that much changes voters who are heavily partisan. But you know what? There are a lot of voters who aren't people who are heavily partisan and don't always show up to elections. So you just don't know what it does there. If they were going to vote the Democratic ticket, are they like, oh, this is grotesque? And, I think, I judge the whole ticket. Are they going to leave the Solicitor General race blank? What do they do? And you know, we don't know, but this is going to be so problematic coming so close to the end of the election, because this is going to be something at the forefront of voters' minds. There's an argument to be made that the government shutdown won't really have much of a bearing on the midterms because voters will forget, and that's a legitimate argument to be made. Voters are not going to forget this before the first week of November.
No, and as you said, certainly in light of the killing of Charlie Kirk and then the conversation that we've had about political violence in just the last month and months that have led up to this. Again, these text messages coming out in 2022, but I don't think there's any time frame in which anyone could look at this and think that they were decent or good, and that would even, I would imagine, come from the Democratic side there. And I'll read to you. You talked about Abigail Spanberger having to speak to this. I mean, she came out on Friday, which shortly after the initial report came out, and said, hey, after learning of these comments earlier today, I spoke frankly with Jay about my disgust with what he had said and texted. I made clear to him that he must fully take responsibility for his words. What I have also made clear is that as a candidate and as the next governor of our Commonwealth, I will always condemn violent language in our politics. And that was before we saw Jay Jones go on television and give his apology. So her campaign decided they were going to jump out really quickly to these text messages, even at a point where people were probably wondering, is this real or not? She just went ahead and said, no, I talked to him about what's coming out, and he needs to apologize. And to your point, Leslie, we've been hearing from Republicans, including Spanberger's opponent, Winsome Earl Sears. She held a press conference over the weekend specifically about this. Let's listen to a portion of what she has to say, and then, Leslie, you and I will chat about that afterwards.
Feel pain personally, do they move on policy? That was Jay Jones, the Democratic nominee for Attorney General of Virginia, running to be, wait for it, our chief law enforcement officer, in his texting with a colleague. We can't pretend anymore that it's just the fringes of political parties that have become violent. No. Jay Jones is the poster child for the Democratic establishment, and yet here he fantasizes about murdered little children lying lifeless in their mother's arms. As Martin Swain wrote in the Wall Street Journal, wacky right-wingers have become violent, but their causes are fringe conspiracy theories, whereas the violence on the left springs from the mainstream Democrat policies and beliefs, not their fringes. So, the calls for hate and violence are coming from the mouths of the Democrat Party's leaders. And Jay Jones is just the most recent, and his wish for violent acts the most clear. So if you can't solve a problem, you can't name it, but I will. And here and now, the leadership of the Democrat Party has become consumed with hate. Try to name a Democrat leader who hasn't called the president Hitler. Try to name one who hasn't said Republicans and our policies are an existential threat to democracy. No, I am not saying Democrat leaders are committing violence, although Jay Jones fantasizes about murdering Republican children. I'm saying this: the leadership of the Democrat Party is inciting violence as a strategy to win power. My opponent, Abigail Spanberger, urges often for her supporters to fill their hearts with violent hate. Let your rage fuel you, Abigail says. Let your rage fuel you. Well, words have meaning. Rage is defined as violent, uncontrolled anger. Abigail Spanberger, running for governor, you can't get more establishment than that, urges her supporters to act with violent, uncontrolled rage against me. Take notice, Virginia. We can stop this if we choose to. The stakes of this election have never been more clear. Charlie Kirk died, reminding us that America is the best and last hope on earth. But our way of life is under violent attack from the left. They canceled us. They silenced us. They lied about the very facts of nature. The mentally unstable are snapping when reality sets in.
So you heard there from Republican candidate and current Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl-Sears, obviously running for governor, speaking very strongly against the comments that came out by Jay Jones and those text messages. In her words, linking it to what appears to be, she's saying a pattern of Democratic leadership advocating or leading or saying things that could potentially incite violence, as she was sitting there saying. And it's interesting, Leslie, to hear her comments. First, I want to ask you this. What have you kind of made out of the response from Republicans in the last few days? Obviously, they've condemned the remarks. They've called for him to step down. But when you hear her say that, what are your immediate thoughts?
The first immediate thought I have is this is unsurprising because it's been very clear for about the past month that what the Sears campaign thinks they have are cultural issues. They're running ads on trans issues, and this sort of thing plays right into that framework. And quite frankly, it gives her an area of strength, at least that she can talk about, where she's got Spanberger kind of reeling back, right? So in some ways, in very few areas of this campaign has Sears had a stronger position relative to Spanberger on an issue. And this is one that she seems to think that's the case. And again, if you're the Spanberger campaign, you have just got blindsided with this. The other thing I would say, though, is Jay Jones is probably not the most popular person among Democrats in leadership right now, precisely because one of the things that they could say after Charlie Kirk's murder is that Democrats in leadership positions were very clear in towing the line about political violence not being acceptable, right? You could find a crazy person on the internet that would condone that violence, but you were not seeing the Speaker of the House do it. You were not seeing somebody in elected office do it. And here, they can kind of take a politician who's on the state level in a competitive campaign in a populous state and say, see, we told you about this political violence thing. We told you Democrats were pushing this political violence thing. And it's clearly untrue to talk about the Democratic leadership doing this in the past. But again, this gives a bit of evidence to what I would argue is a really false claim and allows Winsome Sears to run with it.
And, it is interesting to me, we kind of heard her speak about, she accuses basically like a pattern of violent speak from Democratic leadership. And I always find that interesting when you look at the track record. For instance, President Trump has said things that Democrats absolutely have said, hey, this is something in nature that could incite violence, et cetera, speaking of it in that way. And we do have the president's comments pulled up right now. Sarah, if you can get that on. He posted this to social media, speaking about Jay Jones, very strongly, obviously, against it, and calling the comments sick and demented. And in it, he gives an endorsement of Jason Miyares, says that Miyares has his complete and total endorsement, that Jason will never let you down. Now, what I found interesting about that, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, that is the first time that he has come out and given a strong endorsement of any of the candidates on the Republican ticket, not even Winsome Earl-Sears and not John Reed to this point. It's Jason Miyares, the Attorney General. It's the first time really that he's given a strong sign of support in this race at all.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And again, you could imagine that people on the Sears campaign probably think there would be some value in a Trump endorsement, particularly in generating turnout. So it's an affront, or at least kind of an affront, for her campaign to have an endorsement for the attorney general here and not for her or the lieutenant governor who's running on the Republican ticket. So there's definitely some inter-party politics going on here. But I think part of what you're perceiving when you look at this text from the president is him seeing, okay, I think the lands have shifted a little bit in this race, or the sands have shifted here. And Miyares has probably gotten a bump out of this. And if I endorse this candidate, I can either help him or he's likely not going to be a loser.
All right, so let's get to November now, right? We know that early voting is taking place at this moment, and we saw the polls that were released prior to all of this. And I guess it's important to note that was it the first thing last week that Jay Jones and Democrats had to deal with? Because early in the week it was released that he had been convicted of a reckless driving ticket going 46 miles an hour over the speed limit. Back in 2022, actually was convicted in 2024 after several delays of that judgment. And there was, at the time, the beginning of the week, that was the quote-unquote scandal at the moment that they were kind of dealing with Jason Miyares and questioning his judgment with that situation. And then now you have this situation at the end of the week. So not a great week for Jay Jones in particular last week. But moving ahead to November, you mentioned this is something that voters likely will not forget about. How do you expect this to play when it comes down to the ballot on November 4th?
I would guess that for a lot of Democrats, this isn't going to lead them to vote for Miyares, because Miyares has clearly lined up with the president on a lot of very controversial issues among Democrats, or for Democrats, at least if you look at the polling data in Virginia. So I don't think they're going to switch. I think they might leave the ticket blank, or they might just hold their nose and vote if they found this upsetting. I do think, though, one of the real intangible things you've introduced in this race is the idea that this gins up excitement among the Republican base to vote, just in general in the election, and for a candidate that we know based on the polling data in Sears they weren't super excited about, they weren't enthusiastic about. So you could be really messing with that enthusiasm quotient that often means the party out of presidential power does better in Virginia elections during off years than the party that does have power at the presidential level. So you can be really messing with some of those predictable dynamics.
And you were just kind of explaining, can you spell it out for me? The odds of somebody, we were talking about this prior to, the odds of someone going to the poll and saying, you know what, I'm going to go Democrat, Republican. We don't, or the opposite, Republican, Democrat. We don't really see that as often now, too.
Split ticket voting is much less common than it has been in the past. So voting for one party on the same ticket in which you vote for a member of the opposite party. I will say it still happens, and we especially see this for more conservative Democratic senators who've managed to hold on to their seats in states where President Trump has won, right? It does happen occasionally, but it's not very common, in part because people are so polarized that they're often voting against a party more than they're voting for a party, if you really kind of get down into the nuts and bolts of their thinking when they make the choice. So, I do think when you look at a scandal like this, the whole ticket has to be thinking what sort of repercussions, what sort of ramifications come from this, not just for the particular race in which this scandal happened, the attorney general race, but for the races overall. And let me just say that when you see text message scandals and the like, I think the real concern for the Spanberger campaign right now, and one of the reasons you got the type of statement you did, is because you don't know what else is out there. And the worst case scenario for them is probably a drip, drip, drip of other text messages released over the last few weeks before the election in which you can really keep this scandal going. So there are a lot of intangibles here that are really going to determine how this affects the election. But whenever we're talking about something that might have an effect in such a heavily polarized environment, I think it gives you a sense of the gravity of the scandal, because political scandals, for the most part, particularly those that don't happen immediately before the election, tend to be things that cause campaigns a couple weeks of inconvenience and then they move on. But when you have something timed like this and something that centers on this type of issue, it's going to be hard for the Jones campaign to move past, and it's going to be hard to compartmentalize that damage on the Democratic ticket.
And I'm glad you kind of went that route, because that was going to be kind of some of my final questions there. I'm going to read something to you. Just I thought to look at it in real time to search to see if Jay Jones had said anything after Charlie Kirk's deadly shooting. And he did. He said, "I'm horrified to hear the news that Charlie Kirk was shot. This is a disturbing act of violence that has no place in our communities. No matter who you are or what you believe, we must protect the freedom to speak, debate, and disagree without fear," saying that he was praying for Charlie and his family. That was one of two posts that he made that day. And you kind of alluded to this, which I think may be some of the fear for the Democrats in this scenario, is this is the beginning of what we call the October surprise. Mm-hmm. All right, this was leaked on October 3rd, and the reckless driving scenario was released at the beginning of the week, whatever day that was. Typically, you would think something like this you might wait a little bit longer to release, closer to Election Day, correct? So is there that concern that there could be something else? I don't know. I mean, that's all I've been thinking about, is if this is in text messages and then he's already done a sit down, I don't know what you would do if there's anything that comes out after this that could potentially be at the same level or worse. You would hope that you wouldn't have anything worse than this.
Yeah, or even something that mirrors this, right? I think at best they can hope this is a one-off, and maybe they're able to change the topic of conversation back to the economy, the shutdown, all of these other big things that are going on around this election. But, you just don't know. And for people working in the campaign, you rely a lot on the candidates that you're working with on the campaign to be upfront with what's out there, in part because, the people who do opposition research on candidates, they're really sophisticated. They're pulling in a lot, particularly in these more prominent races, and they are strategic in how they're releasing it. So one of the first things I thought when I saw this was released early in the month was, I wonder if they have other stuff that they anticipate releasing iteratively as we get closer to the election. Right? Because there are arguments that you could make for doing this at the very end of October, middle of October, when you get closer. So you just don't know. And I'm sure the Spanberger campaign is having conversations with Jay Jones about what else might be out there and who else might have it. But this is just, again, this is not the conversation when you're running a campaign that's 10 points ahead that you want to be having in early October.
Certainly not. And let me ask you this. I know we got a few more minutes here. Anything else that you're looking for as we head to, the polls here in just a few weeks and 4 weeks from now? We obviously talked about the big news over the weekend there, but is there anything else that you're kind of keeping your eye on as those people head out to cast their ballot?
Yeah, one of the things I'm watching pretty closely is how the Trump administration is responding to the shutdown in terms of cuts they're making elsewhere. So we've seen them scratch back money that's already been allocated by Congress for Democratic cities like Chicago and New York, or for programming they don't like, but they've been very clear that they think it is on the table to cut federal jobs and cut into federal agencies that they do not like, whose existence or whose funding has already been authorized by Congress. If they start to do that, I think you see a major escalation in this question of attacks on democracy, which we know resonate a little bit more with Virginia voters than they seem to with national voters. And you also risk cutting into the federal workforce in ways that have already hurt Virginia even more deeply, in ways that could have ramifications for candidate Sears as she's moving forward.
Well, this is certainly, it was already a historic race, and now here at the end, it appears that it is getting even more interesting by the day. Of course, all of this comes with the backdrop of President Trump being in Norfolk over the weekend, and his speech that he gave to honor and celebrate the 250th birthday of the U.S. Navy, their naval station Norfolk. And so even those comments that the president pushed out on social media comes with that backdrop, knowing that he was right here in Hampton Roads in Virginia, and all of this happening at the same time, essentially, with the conversation around the race and Election Day, the government shutdown. Whoever said Hampton Roads is not the center of the universe, I just don't know if you can argue that, because certainly right now it feels that way.
Yeah, and certainly to the extent that anything else is getting debated on this government shutdown package, it's probably going to happen around October 15th, because that would be the first date we expect military personnel to not be paid, right? Or my understanding. So yeah, this has huge ramifications for us.
And we know, again, as you were saying there, the House at this point, again, not expected to come back into session at the earliest until next week. And now there's some kind of concerns that may not happen, and you don't know when the Senate could make any kind of decision as well. I think I have enough time to ask you one last question here. Speaking of the Senate here, Dr. Caughell, obviously in order for this to work, one of the sides are going to have to make a concession. Who stands to, I don't want to say lose, but who stands to be impacted the most if they give up their side? Democrats, now that they've dug their heel, or Republicans, now that they've dug their heel? Someone's going to have to give first. What does that mean for those parties?
There are such cross pressures here, because one of the things that strikes me about this particular shutdown is the Democrats are actually asking for something that we know Republicans in the administration have been interested in extending, which is those Obamacare subsidies. There have been leaks within the administration that they're trying to find ways to at least extend them to the people who are getting them, so people don't see their health care premiums spike. Right? So in a lot of ways you could assume, well, the president could give that. And members of the Senate, including Josh Hawley, only voted for the big, beautiful bill, saying we're going to claw back some of that money that's going to harm my constituents through things like these subsidies. So that seems like it would be an easy give and an easy win. Except this is where the personality of President Trump makes this a little less predictable. He doesn't like the idea of kind of giving in or losing, even when his coalition, his voters clearly support something. So I think that really complicates him giving even on that thing that he might have incentive to give on. And for Democrats, I think part of the reason they did this now when they didn't do it a few months ago is they so clearly hear from their voters they want them to fight against the things that the administration is doing that they don't like. And this was an opportunity to do it. That being said, the things they're asking for, the extension of health care subsidies, rolling back some of those Medicaid cuts, guarantees that the president isn't going to take money that's already been allocated by Congress. I don't know how you get those things. And if you do get those things from the president, for example, policy guarantees, he's already demonstrated that, if Congress passes something, he'll use what he perceives as his executive power to take that money back and allocate it elsewhere. So I don't really see where they can get what they want, right? It isn't clear to me what their end game would look like, so I just don't know. And ideally what you'd want is both parties coming in and maybe giving up a little and getting a little. That's what compromise looks like in a healthy government. And what that looks like here, you can't even imagine when you can't get the parties into the chamber to even debate.
My journalism professor in college banned us from writing the words "only time will tell" in any of our scripts, but in this case, truly, only time will tell. And we are out of time here for Live Impact News. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. We got Dr. Leslie Caughell of Virginia Wesleyan University, professor of political science, breaking down a variety of topics. And thank you for tuning in with us as well.